Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is ISIS. The world has been so preoccupied with Russia's invasion of Ukraine that some very important and very dangerous actions outside of the world of Russia and its invasion into Ukraine have gone almost unnoticed and barely a mention in the international news. But we're going to talk about it today because it's important. I'm referring to ISIS, aka ISIL, aka, as they're now called, IS, the Islamic State, aka Daesh. Group members prefer Daesh. Their Arabic name, Daesh, has an extremely active these last few months. They are growing in impact, influence, and most importantly, followers, and most of the world is totally unaware of this. If left alone to grow and to recruit, ISIS will morph into an entity even bigger, more ominous than they were in 2014 at its peak. ISIS's power was at its peak in October 2014. The territory spread from Syria through Iraq. They controlled land stretching from central Syria all the way to the outskirts of Baghdad, including major cities like Mosul, Fallujah, Tikrit, and Raqqa, their capital. The area in real terms was larger than Syria and larger than Iraq. In one of their recent attacks, ISIS struck a Muslim iftar feast in eastern Syria. Iftar means break fast. It's to celebrate the end of a fast day. It's breaking of a long day of fasting, which Muslims observe during the month of Ramadan. Attacking other Muslims is a classic ISIS move. It generates fear and attracts followers. It's the act of murdering other Muslims, those with whom they disagree on Islamic tenets. In the eyes of Islam and ISIS followers, it is done as a show of strength, as a sign that we, ISIS, stand for Islamic principles. We kill Muslim heretics, they say. In this case, the sacrificial lambs, the Muslims that they attacked, were Kurds. Not just any Kurds, Kurds that were aligned with the West. It was a double victory for ISIS. Fear and intimidation are tools that ISIS uses very effectively against other Muslims. Since late February, when U.S. Special Forces killed the then leader of ISIS, Abu Ibrahim al-Qarashai, as many as 30 ISIS strikes have taken place in northeastern Syria. Their strikes are increasing in frequency and intensity. They have called out their followers to attack with whatever means they have available, whichever weapons they have, knives, cars, anything. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a UK-based group that relays most of the information that we have from Syria, is reporting an even larger number than 30 recent ISIS attacks. According to their tally, ISIS has carried out at least 82 attacks since the start of 2022. In Syria, where the Kurds were attacked during iftar, ISIS used guerrilla tactics. They used motorcycles. They sped in and out. In other attacks in Israel, let's say, and in Egypt, they used other tactics. They've also been using sleeper cells, as well as lone wolf attackers. None of this is good news. ISIS is getting stronger. ISIS is emboldened. Sheikh al-Muhajir al-Khamsa al-Qarashi, the current spokesperson for ISIS, released a Ramadan sermon on Telegram. He called on ISIS adherents to follow the leads of the terrorists who attacked Israel. He admonished ISIS followers to follow their path and arm themselves with weapons and carry out further attacks, unquote. He criticized Muslim political leaders who were not following ISIS. He called them out, saying, quote, "Modern Muslim politicians trying to liberate Jerusalem are nothing more than puppets in the hands of Israel and the West," unquote. It's right there in front of our eyes, but the Western world is looking in the wrong direction. If one looks, one can not but see that the world has been infiltrated by a recent and dramatic rise in ISIS activity. The late January prison break in the Hasaka prison in northeastern Syria was a foretelling and ominous of things to come. But nobody paid attention. Nobody connected the dots. Hasaka prison was controlled by the Kurds. It is there that 4,000 ISIS fighters were locked up. The prison break began when 2 car bombs blew up the main gate of the prison. About 200 ISIS members broke into the prison to break out as many ISIS prisoners as they could, especially Daesh leaders. The prison battle went on for a week. Approximately 1,400 prisoners escaped. The battle was waged in prison and in the neighborhood surrounding the prison. In the end, thankfully, many of the escapees were caught and returned to prison. In the big picture, though, that didn't matter to ISIS. The prison break gave ISIS a huge injection of spirit. It catapulted their efforts to recruit and rebuild and proved to be especially attractive to their lone wolf devotees. ISIS is not only on the rise in Syria. Recently, an ISIS group attacked an Egyptian military post that was guarding a water pumping station near the Suez Canal. 11 Egyptian soldiers were killed, including an officer. 5 others were wounded. The ISIS terrorists all escaped. ISIS has a plan, and it's very simple. It's easy. 1, 2, 3. 1, attack. 2, recruit. 3, attack again. ISIS is determined to get back on the map. They will accomplish that by gaining control over new areas. They will strike official facilities to prove that they are better motivated than local armies. And that will gain them street cred and new recruits. ISIS needs to be taken very seriously. ISIS needs to be stopped now before they are completely, once again, running rampant and out of control. Coming up next, points of view. First up is an editorial from Al Jazeera. The editorial was published on April 14th, 2022. An important series of items I need to go over before we address this piece. I read Al Jazeera for many reasons. Most importantly, it gives me insight into mainstream Arab attitudes about everything. It's essential to understand what other significant groups think, especially when we're thinking about the same issues. Yes, Al Jazeera has a bias, and you'll immediately see that bias in the subheadline. But by and large, they are better at coverage and more thoughtful than the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. I know that sounds hard to believe, but it is true, and you'll see that. This is an editorial. It's unauthored. It's part of a series at Al Jazeera that they run called An Explainer. Its purpose is to dive deep into issues and try to explain them to the readers. The editorial is titled, Uptick in Israeli-Palestinian Violence Explained in 600 Words. Subtitled, 16 Palestinians and 14 Israelis have been killed since March 22nd in attacks in Israel and raids in occupied West Bank. The obvious bias is in the subtitle is that there's no differentiation between terrorists who are killed and civilians who are murdered. This is how the editorial begins. Palestinians and Israelis have witnessed an increase in violence over the past month, with Palestinian attackers targeting Israeli cities and Israeli forces stepping up raids, shooting arrests across the illegally occupied West Bank. The recent surge marks the deadliest wave of violence since 2016. The column now gives some background. It continues, and they write, what has happened so far, 4 attacks by Palestinians in 4 Israeli cities have taken place since March 22nd, killing 14 people, while Israel has increased its raids on Palestinian towns and villages, leading to daily clashes and arrests. 16 Palestinians have been killed in the same period, including those who committed the attacks in Israel. The 2 most recent attacks in Israel took place in Tel Aviv and Bnei Brak, and were carried out by Palestinians from the occupied West Bank. No group formally claimed responsibility for the attacks, but the assailant in the Bnei Brak incident was reportedly affiliated with the armed wing of the Fatah political movement, which governs the Ramallah-based Palestinian Authority. The 2 earlier attacks were carried out by Palestinians who were allegedly affiliated with ISIL or ISIS. Not the best coverage, I've got to say, but not bad either. It's not time to pick it apart, but it conveys the facts with only a few problems and a few biases. That's pretty good. Now comes the explanation as to why it happened. This section is much more interesting. Here it goes. Why is this happening now? Palestinians say that the latest outbreak of violence stems from frustration over Israeli policies towards them and the continued occupation of the Palestinian territories, as well as weak Palestinian leadership. These are individual attacks, a pattern that appeared in 2015. Awad Abel al-Fatah, a Galilean-based political analyst, told Al Jazeera. They come as a result of the absence of popular, powerful struggle that the Palestinian leadership is supposed to lead. The alternative at this point is individual attacks that will continue and will increase at a faster pace than before. Palestinians point to the frustration as a root cause for attacks in Israel, while the Israeli government says it is to respond to Palestinian attacks with security operations in the West Bank, leading to more violence. Amazing as it may seem, I would not disagree with a single point in this analysis. I agree with Al Jazeera. They go on to give a pretty good explanation of the motivation behind the Palestinian spike in violence and terror. Al Jazeera writes, the latest bloodshed has coincided with the Muslim holiday month of Ramadan. Last year, violent raids on Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, as well as the Israeli attempts to force out residents of the Palestinian neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem, eventually led to rocket attacks on Israel from the besieged Gaza Strip, and an 11-day war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza itself. The conflict led to the deaths of 232 Palestinians, including 65 children, and 12 Israelis, including 2 children. Al Jazeera now asks about the future. Could the violence escalate, they ask? If Israeli raids continue in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, then the latest uptick in violence could continue into the coming days and weeks. That is particularly the case if there is violence at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, where Palestinians gather in the thousands every night during Ramadan. And they come to the conclusion that there may be an escalation in violence and attacks. According to the editorial, and this is what they write, there is now fear of a new conflict between Hamas and Israel in Gaza. Hamas has called for Palestinian, quote, general mobilization, unquote, to confront Israeli incursions into the West Bank and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. There is the risk of escalation into a wider campaign in Gaza or some events in Lebanon, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz said on Monday. A rise in attacks by armed Jewish groups, particularly inside Israel, is also a possibility. Since earlier this month, armed Jewish groups attacked Palestinians in at least 3 incidents in the Nakba, hospitalizing several. Very interesting piece and worthwhile thinking about. Next up is a column by Carol Markovich. It's from the New York Post, and it was published on May 9th, 2022. The column is entitled, When New York City's Jewish Museum Bans DeSantis, It Sends a Clear Message to All Jews. This is how Markovich begins. History shows us that forced ideological conformity never ends well for Jews, but liberal Jewish institutions keep wanting to give it another go. In the Wall Street Journal piece, Elliot Abrams and Eric Cohn, respectively, chairman of the CEO of Tikva and co-chairman of the Jewish Leadership Conference, reveal that Manhattan's Museum of Jewish Heritage canceled a planned JLC event because Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was invited speaker. Right, Abrams and Cohen, we were working closely with the museum on details for the June 12th event until, out of the blue, we were told the museum staff that Mr. DeSantis didn't align with the museum's values and its message of inclusivity. Either we disinvite the governor, they said, or our event was unwelcome. The museum gingerly pushed back on its Twitter account. It said this wasn't a free speech or censorship issue, but simply a contractual logistical decision, which doesn't actually contradict what Abrams and Cohen are alleging. Now Markovich points out the hypocrisy of the museum, she writes. Thinking it's smarter than everyone else, the museum added a carefully worded tweet saying, "We welcome Governor DeSantis and elected officials from across the spectrum to visit the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, for a tour of our new exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, and when it opens this summer." So it won't block the door if DeSantis buys a ticket for a tour, but no one is welcome to host the governor for an event at the museum. Got it. Abrams and Cohen write that they chose DeSantis because a remarkable Jewish renaissance is underway in Florida. Meanwhile, the museum allowed a 2018 event with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, about a month after she was famously forced to dial back her support for a two-state solution in Israel, as leftist thought does not allow for Israel's existence at all. Does that align with the museum's values? Is this ideology we must all be forced to adhere to before renting space at the museum? In conclusion, Markovich explains why the decision to ban a mainstream public personality from their museum was simply wrong. She writes, "When a Jewish museum bars DeSantis for having the wrong opinions, they bar me and so many other Jews, conservative or otherwise, too. We know that if he is unwelcome, we are also unwelcome. What hate can do is driving America apart. Anyone still funding the Museum of Jewish Heritage should think long and hard about whether that's something worth supporting." This is a great column. The impact of the decision will have financial ramifications. Ina Vernikov a member of the city council just pulled $700,000 of her discretionary money that was directed towards the museum. Redux is a Jewish Brooklynite, originally from Ukraine, who loves Israel and dedicates huge amounts of her time fighting anti-Semitism and educating about the Holocaust. She cannot believe that this is happening, that she's pulling funding from a Holocaust museum. She wrote a letter to all the donors to do the same. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons and memes today. They all make fun of the sinking of the Russian battleship Moskva. The Moskva, or the Moscow in English, was the pride of the Russian Navy. It was their greatest, most modern ship, and it was sunk by multiple simultaneous hits from Ukrainian missiles. The first meme says it all. Heroic cruiser Moskva promoted to submarine. That's what happens when a ship sinks. It becomes a submarine. That's funny. Our second meme is a spin off the iconic game Battleship. Zelensky is on one side and Putin on the other. Zelensky looks very happy. Putin looks like he's losing, and that's what's happening. The next Battleship game, actually, has a battleship with 3 missiles sinking it. The missiles are blue and yellow, just like the Ukrainian flag. Next up is a classic Putin look. He's saying, "You sank my battleship." That's one of those classic signs that he says all the time. The next picture is of the high seas, but it's actually a toy model box made by the model company Revell that specializes in models and scales of ships and cars and planes. The model is scaled 1 to 720. The name of it is Russian cruiser Moskva. And as you can see, it's only a picture of the sea, no cruiser. It sank. That's funny. Finally, Putin's head is on the famous picture of Stalin on the dock. In the first picture, the Moskva is to Putin's left. In the second picture, it's gone. The humor here is that the original picture with Stalin has a smaller man to his left, but in the famous picture, that man is gone. That's funny too. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Sometimes the news just makes you laugh. It makes me laugh, at least. Sometimes items shoot across my screen, and I think it must be a joke, but it turns out to be true. A family of American tourists was leaving Israel after their visit. They arrived at Ben Gurion Airport and, like everyone else, stood in line for security checks, especially for their luggage. And there, in their luggage, it was discovered, or actually they declared, that they were carrying a souvenir they found on their trip to the Golan Heights. They declared that it was a souvenir. What was that souvenir? It was an intact, unexploded, loaded shell. The airport was quickly evacuated. One person was actually hurt in the mayhem and was sent to the hospital. The family was interrogated, and the family was quickly released, and they were even able to fly home on their originally scheduled flight. It was obvious to security that they had no intention of wrongdoing. They just obviously were oblivious to what they were doing in general and the danger of the souvenir they had found. In a certain way, it was a quaint story. Had they been in the United States, the family would have certainly been arrested and charged. The legal principle here in the United States is ignorance is no excuse. In Israel, they handle things a little differently. There was no real threat there, and there was no intention, so they were let go. Israel granted refugee status and citizenship to about 6,000 Russian Jews since the Russians invaded Ukraine. They were obviously granted the right of return, which is one of the things that happens for all Jews, for Olim. As refugees, these new Israelis receive more benefits than they would if they were simple Olim, a simple Jewish immigrant. These 6,000 Russians were granted the same refugee status as Ukrainians, who were truly escaping for their lives. Get the difference. The Russian Jews were not escaping, but they lived with the fear that they may be targeted in Russia simply because they are Jews very soon. Now, 2 months since the invasion into Ukraine, the arrival of Russian refugees to Israel, about 1,800 of these Russians have returned to Russia with their new Israeli citizenship, plus the cash and the other benefits that the Jewish state gave them. As you rightly imagine, Israel is not pleased. The Israeli government, you could say, is livid. The Russians all flew back on El Al or Israel on their own dime. They are the only airlines right now, by the way, that fly from Tel Aviv to Russia, and the tickets are extremely expensive. Not to mention that the flights from Moscow to Tel Aviv were paid by the Israeli taxpayer. These 1,800 people are clearly not refugees. That's obvious because they were able to return. They exploited Israel to get Israeli passport, a passport that's more respected in the Western world than a Russian passport today. That was the reason for it. Ukrainian President Zelensky spoke with Israeli President Bennett about Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov's Hitler's comment. Zelensky called the comments, quote, scandalous and completely unacceptable remarks, unquote. Zelensky also went on air and said that Lavrov's ridiculous pronouncement had outraged the world. Referring to Lavrov's comments, Bennett said, his words are untrue and their intentions are wrong. Using the Holocaust of the Jewish people as a political tool must cease immediately. Lies such as these mean to blame Jews for the horrible crimes committed against them throughout history, and by doing so, remove responsibility from their enemies. Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid was very forceful in his outrage over Lavrov's comments. He found them to be both personal as well as historically untrue. Lapid said, "This is an unforgivable and outrageous statement and a terrible historic mistake, and we expect an apology." He continued, "Jews did not kill themselves in the Holocaust. My grandfather was killed by Nazis. To say that Hitler was of Jewish origin is like saying that Jews killed themselves, and we cannot forgive such a comparison. It enrages me, not only as a foreign minister, but also as a son of my father's, who was put in the Budapest ghetto. He was not put there by Jews, he was put there by Nazis. The Nazis persecuted the Jews and killed 6 million of them. Ukrainians were not Nazis, only Nazis were Nazis, and they had conducted a systematic eradication of the Jewish people." This issue is not going away. The Kremlin firmly asserts that Ukraine is Nazi and fascist. Russia's propaganda machine is in full force telling Russians that through this invasion, they are denazifying Ukraine. This issue is going to stay for a long time. As we've just seen, it's ridiculous and very bold announcement made by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, stating that Hitler was Jewish, set in motion a series of responses that was not Lavrov's intention. Lavrov's intent was to say that it does not matter that the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, is Jewish. Russia still must destroy the Nazism and fascism, Zelensky, of Ukraine. The statement was made in a now famous interview Lavrov gave to Italian media. This is what he said: "I could be wrong, but Hitler also had Jewish blood. The fact that Zelensky is a Jew doesn't mean anything. Wise Jewish people say that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews," unquote. The claim by Russia's foreign minister is 100% false, but that doesn't stop it from being repeated, as in the days of the Soviet Union, and even to discredit Israel and Jews. The Kremlin's intent was to bolster their claim that Ukraine is Nazi and fascist, which is also blatantly false. Just because they're false statements doesn't mean that they're not effective. These pronouncements have awakened a deep-seated hatred of Jews that, in the new Russian era, has been controlled and residing and festering only beneath the surface. There are serious ramifications to these Russian moves and proclamations, and we have to watch them very carefully. It was right out of a comic book. It took place in Antwerp, Belgium. A man was attacking a Jew. The Jew was dressed in traditional Jewish garb. He had a beard, a fur hat, a long black coat, a white shirt. The perpetrator shouted hateful anti-Jewish slurs and then lunged at the Jew. The Jew quickly responded and parried, taking down the bad guy. The scene was filmed by someone watching from a balcony above. The perpetrator was held on the ground by the victim while other people called the police. The police came and arrested the perpetrator. The attacks against the Jews of Belgium are commonplace. They have been on the rise this past year. It's good to see that Jews are responding. 500 Israeli children received teddy bears for participating in an open house for children. The event was sponsored by the Israeli Faculty for Medicine in Tzfat. Every year for the past decade, this branch of Bar-Ilan University's medical school transforms their faculty, their whole facility, into a hospital and creates a program intended to demystify the hospital for children. The goal is to alleviate anxiety. They conduct child-friendly programs in emergency rooms, blood labs, x-ray rooms, cardiac care centers, even in ambulances. The program is called the Teddy Bear Hospital. It's very successful. Many children, as well as adults, have a fear of hospitals, and that fear keeps them from getting early treatment and important care. If this anxiety can be alleviated early, then whenever hospitalizations are required, even if the need arises later in life, these graduates of the Teddy Bear Hospital will feel comfortable enough to quickly access a hospital before their situation turns into an emergency. In the long term, innovative programs like this one saves lives. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Just about everyone has loved a teddy bear at one point or another in their lives. But did you know that there is a Jewish history to the teddy bear? Teddy bear was designed and created by Rose and Morris Mitchum, Russian Jewish immigrants who lived in Brooklyn in the year 1902. They owned a candy store. The original name of the teddy bear that they made was Teddy's Bear, named after Teddy Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt. He didn't like to be called Teddy, by the way. There is, of course, a story of how the Mitchums made the bear. In November of 1902, Roosevelt was in Mississippi moderating a border property dispute and used his downtime to hunt bears with a group of friends. He was not successful in his hunt, and after not finding a bear for several days, a friend tied a bear cub to a tree, hoping the president would shoot it and have a successful hunt. Roosevelt refused to shoot the cub. He said it was unsportsmanlike to shoot a bear like that. He would only hunt animals that had a fighting chance. A political cartoon drawn by Clifford Berryman appeared right after that, November 16th, in the Washington Post, which depicted Roosevelt refusing to shoot the cub, and the bear was sketched as a lovely, cuddly, big-eyed baby bear. The entire nation supported Roosevelt in this decision. It was the talk of the world, not just here, but around the world. Because of the news and cartoon, Rose Mitchum made the teddy bear a toy bear and displayed it in their candy store window at 404 Tompkins Avenue in Brooklyn. It was a tremendous hit. Everyone wanted to own their bear. They even sent Roosevelt himself, apologizing for calling it Teddy, and asked permission to use the name. He was delighted. The teddy bear was so popular that Roosevelt made it the Republican symbol in the 1904 presidential election. The Mitchums eventually closed their candy store and opened a toy factory. They founded the toy factory, Ideal Novelties and Toys. Even the teddy bear has Jewish ancestry. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.